My name is Penelope Rose, and I am 25 years old. Not long ago, I stood in the shadows of a stone church vestibule in my wedding dress, holding a phone that had just delivered a text from my father. It read, "Preston studied for years. Your day can wait. We are hosting his post-bar exam celebration." Down the center aisle, the two front row seats meant for the parents of the bride sat empty. My brother had finished his exams, and in my family that outranked my wedding. But here is the truth none of the guests knew as I walked down the aisle alone. My parents did not just abandon me on my wedding day. They used the distraction of my ceremony to forge my signature and steal my future. What I found out 6 months later, and what I set down on a white tablecloth in front of Boston's most elite lawyers, changed the hierarchy of my family forever. Welcome to QT Told Stories, where quiet women tell the loudest stories of their lives. Drop your age in the comments and let me know where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe because the payoff to this one is worth every second. The air in the church vestibule smelled like old paper and dried roses. I traced the edge of the phone screen, rereading the 12 words my father had typed. He sent the message 10 minutes before the organ was scheduled to play. He did not offer a phone call or a soft excuse. He offered a ruling. In the historic Massachusetts legal circles my parents moved in, my father acted as the judge of our home, and he had just handed down his verdict. Preston was the prized investment. I was the overhead. My family traces its roots through generations of Ivy League courtrooms and Boston old money heritage. You are expected to argue cases that shape state laws. Preston was groomed for a corner office before he could ride a bicycle. Every resource, every tutor, and every ounce of praise was funneled directly into his future. I chose a different path. I became a certified court stenographer. My father liked to tell his golf partners that I took dictation for a living. He saw my career as a failure of ambition. I saw it as a front row seat to watching powerful people lie under oath. It taught me how to read the silence in a room and how to spot a fraud on the stand. Jack stepped into the vestibule, breaking my focus. Jack is a high school history teacher who drives a 10-year-old sedan. He wore a rented tuxedo that bunched slightly at the shoulders, a sharp contrast to the bespoke suits that filled my childhood home. He did not scan the room for my parents. He took one look at my face, gently pulled the phone from my grip, and offered me his arm. I did not cry. Crying was a weakness old money families trained out of their daughters early. I lifted my chin, looped my arm through his, and we pushed the heavy oak doors open. The whispers started halfway down the aisle. A ripple of polite confusion drifted through the pews as the guests realized the bride was walking unescorted, passing the gold ribbons draped over the empty mahogany seats. I kept my eyes fixed on the altar. I said my vows clearly. I smiled for the photographer. I built a tall wall around the rejection and promised myself I would not let them tarnish the one day that belonged to me. We held the reception at a quiet inn 50 miles outside the city limits, far from the country clubs my parents preferred. 3 hours into the evening, the music was loud, the plates were cleared, and Jack was laughing with his brother near the bar. I sat at the head table, slipping my heels off under the long linen cloth. I reached into my silk clutch for a tissue and felt my phone vibrate. It was not a late congratulatory message. It was a push notification from my banking app. Suspicious activity detected. I tapped the screen, blinking against the harsh blue light. A second alert followed from a credit monitoring service. Status change on your primary profile. New account opened. Balance increase. I stared at the screen. The timing was strange. A financial alert ticking away in the middle of my wedding reception felt like a deliberate intrusion. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. It was the exact sensation I get when a witness contradicts their own testimony on the stand. Every instinct honed by my job told me to open the app, to read the detailed report to find out what was shifting under my feet. But I looked up and saw Jack walking toward me. He was holding 2 glasses of champagne, his smile reaching his eyes. I had spent my entire life living in the margins of Preston's achievements. I was not going to spend my wedding night auditing a bank error in a dark corner of a reception hall. I pressed the power button, turned the phone face down on the table, and slid it back into my clutch. I chose the music, I chose the champagne, I chose peace. I had no idea that by ignoring that small digital warning, I was giving my parents a 6-month head start on a crime that would nearly ruin my life. To understand how easily my parents erased my wedding day from their calendar, you have to understand the specific arithmetic of a Massachusetts legal dynasty. In my family, human worth is calculated using a rigid, unspoken formula. Degrees from Ivy League institutions act as the primary currency, and high-profile courtroom victories are the interest that compounds over generations. You are measured entirely by the names embossed on your diplomas and the size of the corporate settlements you negotiate behind closed doors. My parents built their entire social identity around this ruthless ledger. They navigated a world of mahogany-paneled clubs, weekend regattas in Cape Cod, and private dinners that quietly shaped state legislation. In that environment, children are not raised with affection. They are curated as assets. Preston was their prized acquisition. From the moment he could speak in full sentences, he was groomed for a seat on the Supreme Court. His childhood was a relentless, highly funded series of elite prep schools, national debate championships, and strategic handshakes with sitting judges. I was the secondary asset that failed to yield a return. When I chose to attend a local state college and announced my certification as a court stenographer, my parents simply stopped talking about me at their dinner parties. I was no longer part of the grand design. I became invisible, a disappointing footnote in the Rose family legacy. The realization of my exact place in the family hierarchy arrived long before I walked down the aisle, alone. I remember a winter evening 3 years ago. My parents were hosting a holiday gathering for a close circle of Boston old money associates. The house smelled of expensive cedar and catered hors d'oeuvres. I stood near the edge of the living room holding a silver tray of empty crystal glasses because the catering staff was overwhelmed. I was acting as the invisible help my parents preferred me to be. A senior partner from a downtown litigation firm approached my father near the fireplace. Richard stood swirling scotch in a heavy tumbler, flashing the practiced grin he used to disarm opposing counsel. He pointed across the room to Preston, who was wearing a tailored suit and holding court with 2 junior associates. "Preston is making history," my father said, his chest swelling with profound pride. "He is clerking for a federal judge next fall." The senior partner nodded approvingly, then glanced in my direction, noting my presence by the wall. "And Penelope?" he asked. My father did not even turn his head to look at me. He took a slow sip of his drink and waved a dismissive hand through the air. "Penelope is taking dictation. Someone has to write down what the important men say." The surrounding men chuckled a polite grating sound that filled the room. I stood there, gripping the silver tray until my knuckles turned white, letting the laughter wash over me. I did not drop the glasses. I just learned to stop seeking his approval. What my father never understood is that taking dictation is a masterclass in human deception. Being a court reporter requires you to sit in a silent room and transcribe every stutter, every long pause, and every frantic correction a person makes while testifying under oath. You learn to listen to the spaces between the lies. You hear the exact moment a fabricated story begins to collapse under its own weight because the speaker changes their breathing pattern. You stop listening to what people want you to hear, and you start hearing what they are desperate to hide. That specific skill became my armor. It allowed me to sit at family dinners and translate my parents' polite inquiries into the cold interrogations they actually were. It allowed me to pack my bags, marry Jack, and walk away without looking back. 6 months passed after the wedding. Jack and I built a quiet, rooted life in a small town 40 minutes outside the city limits. We traded the high-pressure atmosphere of Boston for a modest house with a wraparound porch and a yard that required weekend maintenance. We spent our evenings cooking dinner together and grading his history papers at the kitchen table. The silence from my parents was deafening, but it was also incredibly peaceful. They did not call for the holidays. They did not send a card. They were busy managing Preston and his post-law school trajectory. I assumed they had simply forgotten me entirely. The digital alert from my wedding night remained buried in the past, a brief anomaly I had chalked up to a banking error and pushed out of my mind. The ledger was closed. I was free. The peace shattered on a Tuesday in late October. The digital clock on the nightstand read midnight. Rain lashed against the bedroom window, masking the initial vibration of my phone on the wooden dresser. When the screen lit up a second time, the harsh light pierced the dark room. I slipped out from under the quilt, careful not to wake Jack, and picked up the device. The caller ID displayed Preston's name. My brother had not called me in a year. The last time we spoke, he was demanding I change the date of my wedding rehearsal because it conflicted with a networking dinner he wanted to attend. I stood in the cold hallway, pressing the phone to my ear, expecting a drunken misdial or a late-night demand for a petty favor. "Penelope," he said. The single word stopped my breath. His voice was unrecognizable. It was entirely stripped of the golden boy arrogance that usually coated his words. There was no Ivy League drawl, no practiced confidence. He sounded frantic, breathless, like a man drowning in a shallow pool. I heard the unmistakable sound of a car engine idling in the background and the rapid drumming of his fingers against a steering wheel. "Preston?" I kept my voice low, leaning against the hallway wall. "It is midnight. Where are you?" "I need you to listen to me," he said, his words tripping over each other. "You cannot tell Mom and Dad. Do you hear me? You cannot call them." The stenographer in me immediately noted the cadence of his panic. He was not asking for a favor. He was cornered. "Tell them what?" I asked, the cold logic of my profession taking over. "I failed," he whispered. The admission sounded like it physically hurt him to say out loud. "I failed the bar exam again. The results posted this morning." A second failure for the Rose family prodigy. In my father's ledger, that was a catastrophic bankruptcy. It meant the corner office was gone. The federal clerkship was gone. The entire narrative my parents had built their social standing upon was a lie. I waited for the instinctual surge of pity, but it did not arrive. "I am sorry, Preston," I said evenly, "but why are you calling me in the middle of the night?" "Because the exam is not the problem," he snapped, his voice pitching higher with raw desperation. "The exam is just the symptom. I am in trouble, Pen. Real trouble." Define real trouble. He took a ragged breath. The drumming against the steering wheel stopped. "I need $50,000. I need it wired into my account by Friday morning." I stared at the shadows on the hardwood floor. $50,000. Jack and I had spent 2 years saving a fraction of that amount for a down payment on our house. My brother was speaking numbers that did not belong in my reality. "You are out of your mind," I told him, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "Call Dad. He funds your entire existence. Have him write a check." "I cannot go to Dad," Preston shouted, the sound cracking the quiet of my hallway. He caught himself lowering his voice to a frantic whisper. "Dad does not know. Nobody knows. If I do not have 50 grand by Friday, the bank takes everything. They will freeze the accounts. They will seize the collateral." "What collateral, Preston? You do not own anything. You rent a luxury apartment on Dad's dime." "Just give me the money, Penelope," he pleaded, the desperation turning into a venomous demand. "You have to help me. You owe me." I pulled the phone away from my ear for a fraction of a second, stunned by the audacity of his statement. I owed him nothing. I had spent my entire existence standing on the sidelines while he consumed every resource my family had to offer. He was the one holding the degrees, wearing the expensive suits, and living in the luxury high-rise. I was the invisible daughter, grading papers in a modest suburban kitchen. Yet here he was, demanding my hard-earned savings to fix a disaster he refused to explain. The conversation was no longer a late-night plea for sympathy. It was a threat, wrapped in the familiar, suffocating entitlement of the Rose family. He expected me to sacrifice my own foundation to keep his golden facade intact, assuming I would fold under the pressure, just as my parents always demanded. I pressed the phone back to my ear, the silence stretching between us as the rain continued to beat against the window pane, setting the stage for a fight I did not start, but was fully prepared to finish. I kept the phone pressed against my ear, listening to the harsh, shallow breathing on the other end of the line. Preston expected me to cave. He had spent his entire life watching our parents dictate terms to the world, and he assumed I would naturally fall in line. I stood in the dark hallway, feeling the cool draft seeping under the front door, and let his demand hang in the air. "I owe you nothing," I finally said, keeping my voice level and quiet. "I am not emptying my savings to bail you out of a crisis you refuse to explain." "You do not understand how this works," Preston hissed. His tone shifted, adopting the exact manipulative cadence our father used when closing a hostile negotiation. "Family must protect family, Penelope. That is the rule. That is how we survive. You are out there playing house in the suburbs, while I am trying to salvage the Rose legacy." My savings belong to my marriage, I told him. Jack and I are closing on a house next spring. I am not setting my own future on fire to keep your reputation warm. Call Dad. Tell him you failed the exam. Let him fix it. I cannot tell him. Preston raised his voice, the panic bleeding through his practiced Ivy League restraint. I need that money by Friday. You have to wire it to me. The answer is no, I said. I started to pull the phone away to end the call, but his next words stopped me cold. You cannot just walk away, Penn. His voice dropped into a vicious, ragged whisper. You think you are safe out there in the woods with your teacher husband, but you are not. Our names are tied together on this. If I go down, you go down. A sharp click signaled the end of the connection. The dial tone echoed in my ear. I lowered the phone, staring at the blank screen. The hallway felt suddenly colder. I walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of tap water, and stood by the sink, watching the rain streak the window pane. Our names are tied together. The phrase rattled around in my head, a strange choice of words for a brother who had spent a lifetime making sure our paths never crossed. Why would our names be tied to his failure? He lived in a luxury high-rise in the city. I lived in a modest suburban rental. We shared no assets. We shared no business interests. Then the memory surfaced. It hit me with the precision of a gavel striking a wooden block. I closed my eyes and transported myself back to the reception hall of the Country Inn 6 months prior. I remembered the heavy linen tablecloth, the sound of the jazz band warming up in the corner, and the weight of my silk clutch resting in my lap. I remembered the distinct sharp vibration against my leg. I remembered pulling my phone out and reading the push notification from the Credit Monitoring Bureau. Urgent. Suspicious activity detected. Status change on your primary profile. New account opened. I had placed the phone face down on the table to protect my peace. I had chosen to ignore the digital warning because I refused to let any more shadows ruin my wedding day. My parents had already stolen my joy by leaving the front row empty. I was not going to let a random banking alert steal my evening. Now, standing in the dark kitchen, I realized that peace was an illusion. The pebble I had ignored on my wedding night was actually a boulder rolling straight toward my life. I did not sleep. I sat in the living room chair watching the gray light of dawn slowly filter through the blinds. At 6 a.m, Jack walked out of the bedroom, tying his tie for work. He stopped when he saw me sitting in the dark, his brow furrowing with concern. I offered him a tight smile, blaming my early rising on a bad dream. He kissed my forehead, poured a travel mug of coffee, and walked out the front door to start his commute. The moment I heard his car pull out of the driveway, I walked into the spare bedroom we used as a home office. I sat down at the desk and opened my laptop. The screen illuminated the small room, casting harsh shadows against the walls. I navigated to the website of the Primary Credit Monitoring Bureau, a portal I had not checked in over a year. I typed in my credentials, answered the security questions, and waited for the dashboard to load. A bright red banner spanned the top of the interface. Critical status alert. I scrolled down to the summary section. The total debt figure listed under my profile hit me like a physical blow. The number was staggering, $185,000. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm echoing in my ears. I clicked on the detailed breakdown, forcing my eyes to process the data row by row. These were not standard federal student loans. These were private, predatory lines of credit designed specifically for law school financing. The interest rates were astronomical, compounding daily. The current account status read, default. 90 days past due. I clicked on the original loan documents attached to the digital file. The screen rendered a scanned PDF of a master promissory note. I scrolled past the dense legal jargon, scanning the designated account holder information. Preston Rose was listed as the primary borrower. Right beneath his name, shining in digital black ink, was the guarantor section. Primary cosigner Penelope Rose. The shock paralyzed me for a full 60 seconds. I sat in the silent room, staring at a screen that contained the financial ruin of my entire adult life. I thought about the down payment Jack and I had painstakingly saved. I thought about the modest house we wanted to buy. All of it was gone, swallowed whole by a 6-figure debt I never agreed to assume. Preston had not called to ask for a favor. He had called to warn me that the trap they built was finally springing shut. Most people would have broken down. Most people would have called their spouse in tears, screaming about the injustice, letting panic dictate their next move. I did not panic. I closed my eyes, took a slow, measured breath, and let the shock evaporate into the air. I reverted immediately to the training that defined my career. When a witness on the stand begins to lie, a court stenographer does not gasp. A stenographer does not interrupt the proceedings to express outrage. A stenographer simply keeps typing, capturing every single contradiction for the official record, ensuring the lies are permanently bound in ink. I disconnected my emotions from the crisis. I became a machine designed to gather evidence. I opened the tray of my desktop printer and loaded a fresh ream of paper. I returned to the credit portal and began downloading every available file. I saved the monthly statements. I captured screenshots of the past due notices. I extracted the digital copies of the origination documents. I clicked print, and the machine beside me hummed to life, spitting out warm pages of my own financial destruction. I read the fine print on the promissory note while the printer worked. The origination date was listed in the top right corner. The loan had been executed exactly 3 days before my wedding. That was the specific week I had spent buried in floral arrangements, seating charts, and last-minute vendor meetings. It was the one week of my life when I was far too distracted to notice missing mail or strange credit inquiries. My parents had orchestrated this with surgical precision, timing the fraud to coincide perfectly with the chaos of my ceremony. I walked into the kitchen, opened a drawer, and retrieved a plain manila folder. I returned to the office, gathered the stack of printed documents, aligned the edges perfectly, and placed them inside the thick paper sleeve. This was no longer just a financial record. This folder was a weapon, and I was going to make sure it was loaded. I sat back down at the computer and located the contact information for the lending institution listed on the statements. I picked up my phone and dialed the customer service number. I navigated through the automated prompts with clinical efficiency, bypassing the initial tier of representatives. When a senior account specialist finally answered the line, I spoke in an icy professional tone. I provided my Social Security number and requested the direct contact information for the regional loan officer assigned to the defaulted account. The representative hesitated, noting the severe delinquency status, but the authority in my voice left no room for debate. She provided a name and an extension. I dialed the new number immediately. A man answered, identifying himself as the senior portfolio manager for the Boston branch. I did not ask for an explanation over the phone. I did not reveal my anger or accuse anyone of a crime. I simply stated my name, referenced the account number, and informed him that I required an immediate in-person review of the physical master files. I scheduled the appointment for 2 o'clock that same afternoon. I ended the call, picked up the manila folder, and prepared to look the fraud directly in the eye. The downtown Boston branch of the lending institution felt less like a bank and more like a mausoleum constructed of frosted glass and brushed steel. The air conditioning hummed above me a low, constant frequency that mirrored the steady cadence of my own pulse. I sat in a high-backed leather chair inside an unadorned office, keeping my posture perfectly straight, my leather bag resting squarely on my lap. Across the polished mahogany desk sat Marcus Reed, a senior portfolio manager who looked far too young to be managing a 6-figure default. He adjusted his silk tie, his eyes darting nervously between his computer monitor and my impassive face. He was accustomed to dealing with panicked debtors, furious parents, or arrogant graduates demanding extensions. He did not know what to do with a quiet woman who simply stared at him, refusing to offer an apology or an excuse. Ms. Rose Marcus began, clearing his throat and attempting to project institutional authority. Given the severe delinquency status of this account, our standard protocol usually involves legal counsel at this juncture. The outstanding principal is substantial, and the grace period expired 3 months ago. I did not blink. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I am not here to discuss a payment plan, Mr. Reed. I requested the master promissory notes. I want the original documents containing the signatures. He tapped his keyboard, his fingers moving quickly over the keys. We sent digital copies to the email address on file months ago. I can print another standard summary if you prefer. It outlines the current interest capitalization and the penalty fees. I leaned forward, resting my wrists on the cool edge of his desk. I do not want a summary. I want the origination file. I want to see the physical pages that legally bound my name to $185,000 of private debt. If you cannot provide them right now, I will have a judge compel you to produce them by Friday morning." Marcus swallowed hard, the bluff folding instantly. The mention of a judge stripped away his corporate script. He stood up, without another word, walked to a secure filing cabinet in the corner of the room, and unlocked the heavy metal drawer with a small key from his pocket. He pulled a thick, heavy stock folder from the hanging files and carried it back to the desk. He slid it across the polished wood. The file landed in front of me with a soft thud. I opened the cover. The crisp scent of fresh toner and aged paper drifted up, filling the space between us. I bypassed the standard disclosures, the truth in lending summaries, and the amortization schedules, flipping directly to the back of the packet. Page 14, the signature execution page. I stared at the bottom line. There, rendered in stark blue ink, was my name, Penelope Rose. But it was not my handwriting. I have spent my adult life analyzing the written word, transcribing human nuance into official records. I know the exact shape of my own signature. My script is efficient, sharp, and hurried, a byproduct of taking rapid dictation. The letters staring back at me from the page were fundamentally different. They were elegant, sweeping, and ornate. The capital P featured a distinct looping flourish at the top, a stylistic choice that required deliberate pacing and a heavy hand. I knew that flourish intimately. I had seen it on thousands of birthday cards, country club checks, and prep school permission slips. It was the handwriting of my mother, Caroline Rose. The betrayal hit me in the chest, sharp and breathless, stealing the air from the small office. My mother had sat at a desk, picked up a pen, and carefully forged my identity. I looked at the date type just above the signature block. It was a Tuesday, exactly 3 days before I walked down the aisle at St. Cecilia's. While I was confirming catering numbers, paying the florist, and trying on my veil, my parents were sitting in a lender's office, signing away my financial independence to cover my brother's tracks. They did not skip my wedding because they were busy celebrating a bar exam. They skipped it because they had just committed a felony against me, and they could not endure the hypocrisy of watching me take my vows. I traced the blue ink with my index finger, letting the cold reality settle deep into my bones. To bind a loan of this magnitude, the lender required more than just a forged signature. They required a sworn third-party verification of identity. I shifted my gaze to the bottom right corner of the page. A raised, embossed seal pressed into the paper, surrounded by a dark black ink stamp. I read the name printed inside the official circle. Patricia Howell. Commission expires 2028. A bitter, hollow laugh almost escaped my throat. Patricia Howe was not a random bank employee or a stranger working at a shipping store. Patricia was my mother's closest confidant. She was her standing Tuesday afternoon bridge partner, a fixture at every Rose family holiday gala, and a woman who had known me since I was a child. She was the same woman who had bought me an expensive silver tea set for my wedding registry. Patricia had knowingly applied her state-sanctioned notary seal to a forged document, legally confirming that I was present in the room when I was actually 50 miles away managing my rehearsal dinner. The conspiracy was not just a desperate, isolated parental mistake. It was a calculated, multi-person fraud executed by the Boston elite to protect their golden boy from the consequences of his own failure. I closed the thick file. I looked up at Marcus Reed, who was watching me with mounting unease. He could see the shift in my demeanor the exact moment the initial confusion evaporated, replaced by cold, unforgiving certainty. "I need certified stamped copies of page 14, I told him, keeping my tone deadly flat. "I need the entire origination packet authenticated by this branch manager before I walk out that door." Marcus did not argue. He did not ask questions. He took the file, walked to the industrial copier in the adjacent room, and returned 15 minutes later with a stack of papers bearing the official raised bank seal. I unlatched my leather bag and pulled out the plain manila folder I had brought from my home office. I slid the certified copies inside, aligning the edges until they formed a perfect, uniform block. This folder was no longer just a collection of financial records. It was a loaded weapon. It held the power to dismantle my family's historic legacy, to strip my mother of her freedom, and to expose Preston as the financial parasite he truly was. I placed the manila folder back into my bag, closed the brass clasp with a sharp snap, and stood up. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Reed," I said, turning toward the door without waiting for his reply. I walked out of the bank and stepped onto the busy Boston sidewalk. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the familiar scent of roasted nuts and city exhaust. I blended into the crowd of afternoon commuters, a ghost moving through the city my family claimed to own. I reached the corner of the block and waited for the crosswalk signal to change. Deep inside my bag, my phone buzzed. The vibration felt heavy against the fabric. I unzipped the side pocket and pulled the device out into the fading sunlight. The screen displayed a new text message. The sender was my father. The words were typed with the same abrupt dictatorial cadence he had used on my wedding day. "Penelope, Preston has encountered a minor setback regarding his career trajectory. We are holding a mandatory family dinner this Saturday at the club to discuss a solution. Your attendance is required. Be there at 7. I stared at the message while the crosswalk signal chimed, signaling the crowd to move forward. A minor setback. A solution. My father was summoning me to a dinner to formally assign me the burden they had already stolen in secret. They planned to manipulate me to guilt me into offering financial support, unaware that the crime was already complete. They thought I was still the invisible stenographer, the naive daughter they could control and discard at will. They did not know I was currently standing on the street corner, holding a certified record of their crimes. I locked the screen, slid the phone back into my bag alongside the manila folder, and stepped off the curb, ready to accept the invitation. The drive back from the bank provided a quiet space to process the forged signature, but my analytical training refused to let the timeline rest. I pulled my car into the driveway of my suburban home, turned off the ignition, and left my hands on the steering wheel. I stared at the plain manila folder resting on the passenger seat. The certified bank documents proved my parents committed a felony to secure $185,000 for my brother. That crime explained my ruined credit profile. It explained the default notices. It did not explain Preston calling me at midnight in a blind panic. Defaulted private loans are brutal, but they operate on a slow, bureaucratic schedule. Banks send warning letters, they deploy collection agencies, and eventually they file civil suits. They do not call a debtor in the middle of the night and demand a wire transfer of $50,000 by Friday morning. That specific sum and that rapid deadline did not belong to a corporate lending institution. That deadline smelled like a shakedown. It smelled like a payoff meant to bury a secret before it reached our father. Preston had a leak in his boat, and the forged loan was not enough to bail him out. I needed to find the missing piece. I grabbed the folder, unlocked my front door, and walked straight into my home office. To the high-powered attorneys in my family, I was just a girl who typed fast. They viewed court reporters the same way they viewed the janitorial staff, treating us as invisible fixtures in the room. They never realized that being invisible is a distinct tactical advantage. Because lawyers ignore us, they speak freely in front of us. More importantly, we form alliances with the other invisible people who actually keep the legal system functioning. The clerks who manage the dockets, the paralegals who draft the motions, and the administrative coordinators who process the disciplinary files are my colleagues. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was a senior coordinator at the State Office of Bar Counsel, the regulatory body that handles attorney licensing and ethical complaints. I had shared bad coffee and late-night transcription sessions with Sarah for 3 years before she moved to the regulatory office. I dialed her number. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. We exchanged brief pleasantries before I shifted my tone to convey professional urgency. I told her I needed a quiet favor regarding a bar applicant. "Give me a name," she said, the clicking of her keyboard echoing through the receiver. "Preston Rose," I replied. The typing stopped. A heavy silence settled over the line. "Penelope, you know I cannot distribute active disciplinary files," she whispered, her professional warmth evaporating. "I am not asking for a distribution, Sarah. I am asking for context. He is my brother, and my financial security is currently tied up in his academic record. I need to know why his file is flagged." I heard a slow exhale followed by the soft clatter of keys as she accessed the restricted database. He did not just fail the exam, Penelope. His score was invalidated. Validated for what I pressed. for severe academic fraud. The details are grim. He was caught using an unauthorized digital transmitter during the testing session. When the proctor confronted him in the hallway, Preston panicked. He offered the proctor a cash bribe to walk away and pretend the confrontation never happened. I closed my eyes, absorbing the sheer stupidity of the crime. My brother, the heir to a century of legal prestige, tried to bribe a standardized testing official. It was not just a failure, it was a permanent disqualification. He would never hold a license to practice law in any jurisdiction. There is a secondary complaint attached to the file, Sarah continued, her voice dropping lower. A private tutor named David Hayes submitted an ethics grievance against your brother last week. Hayes claims Preston hired him to bypass the proctoring software during his character and fitness review courses and then refused to pay the agreed fee. Hayes attached a formal demand letter to the grievance. He is demanding a $50,000 settlement by this Friday. If the funds are not wired, Hayes is taking the story to the press and filing a public breach of contract lawsuit. The puzzle snapped together with chilling clarity. The midnight phone call, the frantic demand for my savings, the Friday deadline. Preston was trying to pay off his accomplice before the scandal leaked to the Boston legal blogs and reached our father. He wanted to drain my bank account to buy the silence of a defrauded tutor. I thanked Sarah, promised her lunch the next time I was in the city, and ended the call. I turned to my computer, navigated to the public disciplinary docket on the state registry, and searched for the preliminary hearing notices. There it was, buried in the administrative schedule, a formal censure hearing for Preston Rose, citing academic dishonesty and bribery. I clicked the print icon. The machine hummed to life, producing the single sheet of paper that represented the total destruction of my family's grand illusion. The golden boy was a fraud, and my parents had stolen my identity to finance a career that no longer existed. I took the warm piece of paper and slid it into the manila folder, placing it directly behind the certified copies of the forged promissory note. The folder felt heavier now. It contained both the crime committed against me and the humiliating truth they were trying to hide. Heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway. Jack appeared in the doorway of the office, still wearing his work trousers, his tie loosened around his collar. He saw the grim expression on my face and the thick folder resting on the desk. He stepped into the room, leaning against the doorframe. "What is going on?" he asked, his brow furrowed in concern. I opened the folder and handed him the documents. I watched his eyes scan the forged signature, the staggering debt balance, and the printed disciplinary notice. I watched his expression shift from confusion to cold, hard anger. Jack is a patient man who spends his days teaching history to restless teenagers, but he possesses a fierce protective streak. He dropped the papers back onto the desk. "We are calling the police," he stated. "Then I am driving you to your father's house and we are going to have a very loud conversation." I shook my head, retrieving the papers and sliding them back into the protective sleeve. No police. Not yet. My father summoned me to a family dinner at the country club this weekend. He wants to discuss a solution to Preston's minor setback. Jack stepped forward, his jaw clenched tight. "I am coming with you." "You cannot come with me, Jack." I stood up, placing my hand gently on his chest. "You are my safe harbor, and I love you for wanting to protect me. But I need to walk into that dining room alone." "Why on earth would you face them by yourself?" "Because my parents operate on perceived leverage," I explained, keeping my voice steady. "If you are standing next to me, they will moderate their behavior. They will play the polite, concerned in-laws and hide their cruelty behind pleasantries. I do not want them polite. I want them unrestrained. I want them to believe I am isolated, unsupported, and cornered. They will only spring the trap if they think they hold all the power. I have to let them initiate the ambush in front of their chosen audience." Jack studied my face for a long time. He saw the cold determination settling behind my eyes, the stenographer preparing to record the final judgment. He let out a slow sigh and nodded, stepping back to give me space. "Just call me the second it is over," he said. Saturday evening arrived with a biting autumn chill. I dressed in a tailored navy blazer and dark slacks, choosing clothes that felt like armor. I placed the manila folder into a sleek leather tote bag, kissed Jack goodbye, and drove toward the city. The Rose family held a legacy membership at an exclusive country club situated on the edge of Boston. It was a sprawling, historic estate surrounded by towering oak trees and wrought iron gates. I pulled my car onto the pristine gravel driveway, the sound of the tires crunching loudly in the quiet night. The imposing stone facade of the clubhouse loomed ahead, its walls covered in thick, dark ivy that looked like veins crawling up the brick. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed forward to open the doors of expensive luxury sedans. I handed my keys to an attendant, adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder, and looked up at the warm yellow lights spilling from the arched windows. Inside that building, my father had gathered our extended family to watch me fold under his authority. He had set a velvet trap, confident that I would obediently step into the snare. I walked up the wide stone steps, feeling the solid weight of the evidence resting against my side, fully prepared to tear their world apart. The foyer of the country club smelled of polished brass and century-old oak. A uniformed maitre d' greeted me by name, a subtle reminder that my father had likely provided a guest list with strict instructions. He led me down a long carpeted hallway lined with oil portraits of past club presidents, men who looked remarkably like the relatives I was about to face. We stopped in front of the heavy double doors of the Wellington Room, a private dining enclave usually reserved for corporate mergers and closed-door political endorsements. The maitre d' pushed the doors open. I stepped over the threshold and immediately understood the architecture of my father's plan. He had not convened an intimate family discussion. He had assembled a jury. The long mahogany table was set for 14. Crystal water goblets and silver chargers caught the light from the low-hanging chandelier. Seated around the perimeter were the most influential members of the extended Rose family network. Aunt Vivian sat near the center, adjusting a strand of heavy pearls. She was a senior partner at a corporate defense firm, a woman who treated every conversation like a cross-examination. Across from her sat Uncle Graham, a retired appellate judge who still expected everyone in his presence to defer to his opinions. Beside them were assorted cousins and in-laws, all prominent figures in the Boston legal ecosystem. This was not a dinner party. It was a tactical deployment of social pressure. My father had curated an audience designed to strip away my autonomy. In this room, defiance was not just a personal insult, it was a breach of the social contract that governed their entire existence. Near the head of the table, Preston sat staring at his empty plate. He wore a crisp charcoal suit, but his posture betrayed his panic. His shoulders were rounded and his hand rested on the base of his wine glass, his fingers tapping a restless, anxious rhythm against a crystal stem. He looked up when I entered, his eyes darting toward our father before quickly returning to the table. My mother, Caroline, stood up from her chair the moment the doors closed behind me. She wore a soft beige cashmere sweater, the unofficial uniform of the tragic, long-suffering matriarch. She crossed the Persian rug with her arms extended, a manufactured smile plastered across her face. "Penelope, darling," she announced, her voice pitched perfectly to ensure every relative in the room heard her greeting. She wrapped her arms around my shoulders, pulling me into a rigid embrace. Her perfume, a sharp floral scent, filled my lungs. She pressed her cheek against mine, maintaining the illusion of maternal warmth for the watching audience. "I am so relieved you decided to join us," she whispered, her tone dripping with weaponized grace. "We have all been so worried about the distance you keep. Family needs to heal." She pulled back, keeping her hands on my arms, and offered the room a brave, watery smile. She was playing the victim flawlessly, painting me as the estranged, difficult daughter who had finally returned to the fold to fulfill her obligations. Aunt Vivian offered a sympathetic nod. Uncle Graham cleared his throat in quiet solidarity with my mother's perceived struggle. I did not offer a polite response. I did not apologize for my absence. I gently removed her hands from my arms, offered a curt nod to the surrounding relatives, and walked toward the single empty chair situated near the foot of the table. I pulled the chair out and sat down. I took the leather tote bag off my shoulder and placed it carefully on the carpeted floor, directly beside my feet. Inside that bag rested the plain manila folder, holding the certified bank records and the disciplinary notice. The physical weight of the evidence grounded me, providing a quiet anchor against the overwhelming tide of Ivy League arrogance filling the room. The waitstaff moved silently through the room, pouring vintage wine and serving the first course. The conversation around the table remained superficial, a polite hum of country club gossip and courtroom anecdotes. I drank sparkling water and observed the dynamics. My training as a court stenographer kicked in, allowing me to detach from the emotional weight of the room and simply record the behavior. I watched my father orchestrate the flow of dialogue. I watched Preston drink 2 glasses of wine in rapid succession. I watched my mother monitor my reactions, waiting for a sign of weakness. When the main course was cleared, the ambient noise in the room began to settle. The waitstaff retreated, closing the heavy double doors behind them. Richard Rose stood up from the head of the table. He picked up a silver spoon and tapped it lightly against the rim of his crystal wine glass. The sharp, clear chime brought the room to an immediate halt. Uncle Graham squared his shoulders. Aunt Vivian folded her hands over her napkin. Everyone turned their attention to the patriarch. My father buttoned his suit jacket, a deliberate theatrical gesture that signaled the beginning of a formal address. He looked out over the assembled relatives, his expression grave but resolute. "We are gathered here tonight because the Rose family has always understood the true meaning of legacy," he began, his voice dropping into the resonant, authoritative register he utilized during closing arguments. "We are not just a collection of individuals. We are a continuous line of legal excellence. For over a century, our name has meant something specific in this city. It means integrity. It means resilience. Above all, it means bearing the burden of greatness." He paused, letting the words echo against the wood-paneled walls. The relatives absorbed the flattery, their expressions reflecting immense self-satisfaction. "Greatness is not a smooth path," my father continued, turning his gaze toward Preston. "Sometimes those who carry the heaviest expectations encounter hurdles. The path to the bench is fraught with archaic testing methods and bureaucratic red tape. Preston has recently encountered a minor temporary stumbling block regarding his bar admission." I watched Preston flinch at the mention of the exam. He stared downward, unable to meet the eyes of the uncles and cousins who believed they were funding a future Supreme Court justice. My father was framing a permanent expulsion for academic fraud and bribery as a mere scheduling delay. He was building a narrative bridge, constructing a fictional reality where Preston was still the golden boy, unfairly penalized by a flawed system. "But a stumbling block is simply an opportunity for a family to demonstrate its core strength," my father said, his voice rising with practiced conviction. "When one pillar of this house takes a brief pause to regroup, the other pillars must bear the weight. We close ranks, we protect our own. That is the Boston way. That is the Rose way." He stopped pacing. He turned his head slowly, tracking the length of the long mahogany table, until his eyes locked directly onto mine. The shift in the room was palpable. The air grew still. The attention of 14 elite legal minds pivoted in unison, their collective gaze landing on the quiet daughter sitting at the foot of the table. "Penelope," my father said, his tone shifting from grand rhetoric to a sharp, patronizing cadence, "you have chosen a very different life for yourself. You live out in the quiet suburbs. You married a public school teacher. You work a simple, unburdened job. You have insulated yourself from the crushing public expectations that your brother navigates every single day." He took a slow step forward, resting his hands on the back of Preston's empty chair, visually linking the two of us in his crosshairs. "We have allowed you your distance," he stated, presenting his neglect as a generous concession. "We have allowed you to play house while your brother pursued the family legacy. But the time for standing on the sidelines has passed. Preston needs a bridge. He needs a temporary foundation while he restructures his career timeline. Because you live such a simple, unencumbered life, you are uniquely positioned to step up. The family is calling upon you to do your duty." Aunt Vivian nodded approvingly, her sharp eyes fixed on my face. Uncle Graham let out a low murmur of agreement. My mother sat beside my father, her hands clasped tightly under her chin, projecting an image of prayerful hope. They expected me to lower my head. They expected me to shrink under the combined weight of their scrutiny, to accept the role of the dutiful, invisible servant, offering her meager resources to save the crown prince. They had constructed an impeccable social trap, assuming the sheer force of their collective arrogance would compel me to surrender without a fight. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the tablecloth. I looked at my father, then at Preston, and finally at the 14 relatives waiting for my submission. The trap was sprung, the jaws locked tight around the table, leaving the room breathless for my reaction. The silence in the Wellington room felt dense, pressing against my shoulders like physical weight. My father remained standing at the head of the mahogany table, his chin lifted, basking in the unified approval of the relatives. He had delivered his verdict. He had painted my suburban life not as a choice, but as a debt I owed the family, a ledger that was now due for collection. He slowly took his seat, adjusting his suit jacket, passing the tactical baton to my mother. Caroline Rose never missed a cue. She unclasped a slim leather portfolio resting beside her plate. Her movements were deliberate and fluid, practiced over decades of charity galas and silent auctions. She extracted a crisp, bright white document, the thick paper stark against the dark wood of the table. She laid it flat on the pristine linen cloth. From her purse, she produced a heavy silver fountain pen, the polished metal gleaming under the glow of the chandelier. With a gentle push, she slid both the document and the pen down the length of the table. The paper glided over the fabric, coming to a halt precisely 2 inches from my water goblet. "It is just a standard family support agreement, darling," my mother said. Her voice was sponge sugar light and maternal, designed to project warmth to the watching aunts and uncles while delivering poison directly to me. "We spoke with the accountants this morning. Since Preston is transitioning between clerkships to focus on his upcoming exam retake, we need to restructure some of his educational financing." She paused to offer the room another brave, tight-lipped smile. "Your father and I are restructuring our own portfolios to handle the bulk of the burden. We are only asking you to step in temporarily to manage the monthly minimums on a single account. It keeps the family assets liquid. It is a mere formality, Penelope. A bridge, just as your father said." I looked down at the paper. I did not reach for the silver pen. My mother leaned forward, placing her elbows on the table, folding her manicured hands together. "We know you and Jack live a modest life. We are not asking for a check tonight. We just need your signature to authorize the account transfer. It shows solidarity. It shows the bank that the Rose family stands united during a minor transition." I kept my hands in my lap and lowered my eyes to the text. To a layperson, the page looked exactly like the benign administrative paperwork Caroline described. The header was printed in a friendly bold font, internal family support and temporary assignment agreement. The first paragraph was filled with soft legalese about mutual support and shared familial responsibilities. But I am a court stenographer. My entire profession involves stripping away the pleasant tone of a speaker and isolating the cold, hard facts of the record. I read legal filings the way musicians read sheet music. I scan past the introductory fluff and zero in on the binding clauses buried in the dense blocks of text near the bottom of the page. My eyes track down the crisp white sheet. I skipped the indemnification preamble and landed on a paragraph tucked cleanly above the signature block. "The undersigned hereby acknowledges full and primary responsibility for the debt obligations outlined in Exhibit A, affirming that all prior executions, signatures, and agreements related to said account were made with full consent, knowledge, and authorization." The breath caught in my throat, though I kept my face frozen in a mask of polite attention. This was not a temporary support agreement. This was a retroactive consent form. My parents knew they had committed a felony when my mother forged my name 3 days before my wedding. They knew that if the bank audited the file, or if I ever discovered the staggering balance, they would face criminal prosecution for identity theft and wire fraud. They orchestrated this entire elaborate dinner to trap me into legalizing their crime. If I picked up that silver pen and signed the bottom of this page, I would be legally ratifying the forged promissory note. I would be telling the law that I had consented to the debt all along, absolving Caroline of the forgery, and permanently locking myself into a 6-figure financial crater. They were smiling at me, offering me a glass of wine and a silver pen, while quietly handing me the shovel to dig my own grave. The silence in the dining room began to stretch, shifting from expectant to uncomfortable. The relatives were waiting for the quick, obedient resolution my father had promised. I heard the faint clinking of ice against crystal as someone took a nervous sip of water. Aunt Vivian let out a sharp, exasperated sigh. She leaned across her plate, fixing me with a stern, impatient glare. "Penelope, please, let us not turn a simple administrative task into a theatrical production. Your parents are doing everything they can to manage a difficult situation. Be a team player. Pick up the pen and sign the paper so we can order dessert." Uncle Graham grunted his agreement, checking his gold wristwatch. "The girl has always had a flair for the dramatic, Caroline. Just tell her where to sign." I did not look at Vivienne or Graham. I shifted my gaze down the table to my brother. Preston was unraveling. The polished veneer of the Ivy League scholar had melted away. A bead of sweat traced the line of his jaw. He was staring intensely at his half-eaten steak, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. He knew exactly what was printed on that document. He knew I was staring at a retroactive confession. He gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were stark white, terrified that my hesitation meant the scheme was falling apart. "Penelope," my father warned. His voice had lost the grand rhetorical flourish. It was now low, hard, and laced with a subtle threat. "Do not embarrass us. Sign the document." I reached out and placed my fingertips on the edge of the crisp white paper. I felt the heavy grain of the expensive stock. I looked at the silver pen resting beside it, understanding the full weight of the choice presented to me. I could sign away my future, my home with Jack, and my financial security to maintain the illusion of a family that had never truly claimed me. Or I could push the paper back and watch the historic Rose legacy burn to the ground. I lifted my hand away from the document. I sat back in my chair, straightening my spine against the dark wood. I looked past the imposing figures of my aunt and uncle. I looked past my sweating, panicking brother. I locked my eyes directly onto my mother, meeting her manufactured, sugary gaze with a cold, unyielding stare. "I can't sign this, Mom," I said. My voice was perfectly calm. It did not shake. It did not echo. The words dropped into the center of the Wellington room like a stone falling into a quiet pond, sending silent ripples of shock outward to every corner of the table. The polite, gilded facade of the Boston dynasty fractured in that single second. My mother's brave smile vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine, naked panic. My father's jaw clenched, his face darkening with a sudden, furious rush of blood. The collective breath of 14 elite relatives hitched in unison. The trap had failed to close, and the stage was perfectly set for the retaliation. The scrape of wooden chair legs against the Persian rug broke the silence. My father stood up. The polished diplomatic veneer he had maintained all evening vanished in an instant. A deep, dark flush crept up his neck, staining his cheeks a mottled crimson. In the span of a few seconds, he went from a benevolent patriarch offering a generous compromise to a cornered litigator whose star witness had just recanted on the stand. He stared down at me, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. I had not just refused a request, I had challenged his authority in front of the only audience whose opinion he valued. Uncle Graham and Aunt Vivian were watching, waiting to see how the head of the Rose family handled a rebellion within the ranks. My father had to crush my defiance quickly to preserve his standing. He resorted to the oldest tactic in his courtroom arsenal. He began the character assassination. "You have always been like this, Penelope," he sneered, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Selfish, vindictive, unwilling to see beyond your own petty grievances." He paced a short line behind Preston's chair, gesturing toward his son like an exhibit presented to a jury. "Your brother possesses a brilliant legal mind. He is navigating a complex, high-stakes transition that requires structural financial backing. We are talking about institutional capital, sophisticated loan restructuring, and temporary liquidity. But you sit there shaking your head, refusing to help your own flesh and blood because you lack the intellectual capacity to understand the stakes." He let out a harsh, derisive scoff, looking toward Uncle Graham for validation. "How could you possibly understand? You are a court reporter. You spend your days typing out the words of educated men. You take dictation. You live in a small house, playing a small role, and you resent Preston because he is destined for a stage you could never hope to occupy. You are jealous of his future, so you are trying to sabotage him now when he needs a simple signature." I kept my eyes fixed on his face, absorbing the verbal assault without a flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend my intelligence or my career. I did not point out that his brilliant legal scholar was currently sweating through his shirt, staring blindly at a half-eaten cut of beef. I let my father speak. I let him lay the foundation of his own ruin, word by bitter word. My mother sensed the momentum shifting and capitalized on the opening. She brought a crisp linen napkin to her face, dabbing at the corners of her eyes. It was a flawless, practiced performance. "We gave you everything, Penelope," she whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. "We raised you with every privilege, and how do you repay us? You humiliate us. You punish us." She looked around the table, ensuring the relatives were captivated by her grief. "Do you all know what she did?" We had an unavoidable family crisis to manage during the weekend of her wedding. We asked for her understanding, just a small measure of grace. Instead, she abandoned us. She walked down that aisle out of spite, turning a minor scheduling conflict into a public spectacle to embarrass this family. And now, when we ask for one small favor to keep her brother's dreams intact, she refuses. She is punishing Preston because her father and I had to miss a party. The narrative was breathtaking in its audacity. She took the darkest day of my life, stripped away her own cruelty, and recast herself as the tragic victim of an ungrateful child. The jury rendered its verdict almost immediately, the Wellington room filled with a low collective murmur of disapproval. Aunt Vivian shook her head, her lips pressed into a tight, thin line of disgust. Uncle Graham crossed his arms, glaring at me from across the table. Assorted cousins exchanged pointed, judgmental glances. They were convinced by the fiction playing out in front of them. In their eyes, I was exactly what my parents described, a petty, vindictive girl holding a grudge, willing to ruin her brother's shining trajectory over a missed wedding RSVP. The social pressure in the room grew suffocating. The silent stares demanded my surrender. The Rose family expected the weight of their collective disdain to break my resolve, to force me into compliance, just to escape the shame of their judgment. I let them judge me. I sat in the chair, my breathing slow and even, watching the performance unfold. Being a court stenographer teaches you a vital lesson about human behavior. When a liar realizes they are losing control, they always talk too much. They construct elaborate, towering stories to justify their actions, desperate to convince the audience that they are right. The cardinal rule of recording a hostile witness is simple. Never interrupt a liar who is busy digging their own grave. You let them talk. You let them stack their falsehoods as high as possible, ensuring every contradiction, every cruel manipulation, and every fabricated detail is securely entered into the record. The deeper the hole they dig, the more devastating the fall becomes when the truth finally surfaces. I waited while my mother finished her tearful monologue. I waited while the relatives murmured their quiet condemnations. I waited until the room grew still again, the heavy silence returning to settle over the mahogany table. My father stopped pacing. He stepped up to the table, looming over my chair. His face was rigid, his patience exhausted. He pointed a trembling finger at the silver fountain pen resting on the white linen cloth. "I am done indulging this tantrum," he stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You are holding this family hostage over your own insecurities. You will stop this theatrics right now. You will pick up that pen, you will sign the document, and you will do your duty to the Rose name." He leaned closer, resting his knuckles on the edge of the table. "Pick it up, Penelope." The room held its breath. Aunt Vivian leaned forward in her seat. Preston finally looked up from his plate, his eyes wide, waiting for the nightmare to end. My mother lowered her napkin, a triumphant glint returning to her eyes. They all believed the breaking point had arrived. They believed the sheer, crushing force of my father's authority had finally cracked my defenses. I moved my hand away from the edge of the table. A collective, silent sigh of relief seemed to pass through the relatives. They expected my fingers to wrap around the polished silver barrel of the fountain pen. They expected me to pull the retroactive consent form closer to sign away my credit, my home, and my future to preserve their fragile illusions. Instead, I bypassed the pen entirely. I reached down toward the carpeted floor. My hand found the smooth leather handle of my tote bag. I unzipped the main compartment, the metallic sound cutting sharply through the quiet dining room. I reached past my wallet and my keys, my fingers closing around the thick, heavy stock of the paper sleeve I had carried from my home office. I sat back up, withdrawing my hand from the bag. I did not pull out a tissue to wipe away tears of surrender. I did not produce a checkbook to offer financial appeasement. I pulled out the plain manila folder. I rested it on my lap for a brief second, feeling the solid weight of the certified bank copies and the disciplinary notice. The expressions around the table shifted from triumphant relief to mild confusion. My father frowned, staring at the unmarked file. My mother's posture stiffened, her eyes darting between the folder and my calm, unwavering face. The trap they had spent days building was about to snap shut, but they had misjudged who was standing inside it. I lifted the plain manila folder from the floor. The friction of the heavy paper sliding against the leather of my tote bag sounded remarkably loud in the quiet room. I brought the file into the warm glow of the brass chandelier hanging above the mahogany table. The stark utilitarian folder looked entirely out of place against the delicate crystal goblets, the polished silver cutlery, and the pristine white linen. I did not toss it down dramatically. I moved with the slow, deliberate precision of a clerk entering a crucial piece of physical evidence into the official court record. I reached across the table and set the folder down right next to my mother's wineglass. The soft thud of the paper settling against the wood silenced the remaining whispers in the room. My father glared at the file, his jaw tight, his patience fraying. "What is this, Penelope Moore theatrics? I told you to pick up the pen and sign the document." I kept my hands resting gently on the edge of the table. I did not shout. I did not let my voice tremble with the decades of resentment they had just tried to exploit. I spoke in the flat, exact tone of someone reading a transcript back to a silent courtroom. "You did not skip my wedding because you were celebrating," I said, slicing through the heavy tension filling the Wellington room. My mother blinked, her linen napkin still hovering near her cheek. "I just explained to everyone that we had an unavoidable scheduling conflict." "You skipped it," I continued, my voice steady and unwavering, "because you were busy forging my name." I flipped the cover of the folder open. The certified copies of the bank records lay in a pristine stack authenticated by the raised embossed seal of the lending institution. I extracted the master promissory note from the top, careful to keep the pages in proper order, and slid the document to the exact center of the table. "Page 14, I instructed the room. Uncle Graham, the retired appellate judge, reacted on pure, ingrained instinct. Before my father could intercept the paper, Graham reached across the table and picked it up. He withdrew a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket, unfolded them, and slid them onto his nose. His trained eyes immediately bypassed the standard boilerplate text, scanning straight down to the execution block at the bottom of the page. He knew exactly what to look for. He was searching for the dates, the printed names, and the authenticating signatures. I pointed toward the document resting in his hands. "Look at the signature line in blue ink. That is not my handwriting. My script is hurried and sharp. That signature features the distinct, sweeping cursive of my mother." I turned my gaze back to Caroline. The linen napkin slowly lowered to her lap. "You stole my credit profile to take out $185,000 in private, high-interest loans for Preston. You sat in a bank office 3 days before I walked down the aisle, and you committed identity theft." A collective gasp rippled through the seated relatives. In a room full of people who spent their entire lives studying, interpreting, and enforcing the law, the word felony carried an electric charge. "Furthermore," I said, keeping the rhythm of the revelation relentless, "a loan of that magnitude requires a sworn verification of identity. If you look at the bottom right corner of that page, Uncle Graham, you will see a certified state notary stamp." Graham squinted at the seal, reading the text aloud in a low, gravelly whisper. "Patricia Howell." "Yes," I confirmed. "Patricia Howell, your standing Tuesday bridge partner, Mom. You had your closest friend illegally notarize a fraudulent document, making her a direct accomplice to wire fraud." The dining room went dead silent. The ambient noise of the country club beyond the heavy double doors seemed to fade into a vacuum. Caroline's practiced tears stopped instantly. The physiological shift was startling to witness. The sorrowful, victimized expression she had worn for the last hour vanished, replaced by a pallid, rigid mask of sheer terror. Her eyes darted from the document in Graham's hands to the faces of the relatives staring back at her. The polite society she ruled was suddenly examining her not as a benevolent matriarch, but as a criminal suspect. Richard scrambled to regain control of the narrative. A seasoned litigator knows that when the facts are against you, you argue the law, and when the law is against you, you pound the table. But he had no table left to pound. The documentary evidence was sitting right in front of a retired judge. "Now hold on a minute," my father stammered. His booming voice suddenly sounded thin, reedy, and frantic. "This is a gross mischaracterization of a family financial arrangement. It was a misunderstanding. The bank required a secondary guarantor at the 11th hour to secure Preston's educational funding. We were acting under immense time constraints." He reached out, trying to pull the paper away from his brother, but Graham held it firmly out of reach, his expression hardening into a severe scowl. Aunt Vivian leaned over Graham's shoulder, her face draining of color as she recognized the blue cursive script. It was a temporary bridge loan. Richard continued, sweat beading along his hairline. He tried to drown the room in corporate jargon, hoping to obfuscate the reality of the crime. We fully intended to satisfy the balance before the repayment period began. We were protecting the family assets during a collateralized transition. We meant to pay it back, Penelope. Nobody stole anything. You forged my name to a binding contract and hid the default notices for 6 months, I replied, stripping away his desperate spin with stenographic precision. You did not orchestrate a bridge loan. You committed a crime, and tonight you tried to trick me into signing a retroactive consent form to bury the evidence. I gestured toward the crisp white document my mother had slid across the table earlier. That support agreement was designed to legalize the forgery. You knew the bank was closing in, so you brought me here to make me the human shield. You were willing to let me assume $185,000 of defaulted debt to save yourselves from a prison sentence. The physical proof was undeniable. The relatives, all obsessed with legality, reputation, and avoiding public scandal at any cost, stared at the forged document in absolute horror. Aunt Vivian pressed a hand to her chest, her mouth slightly open, processing the magnitude of the liability sitting on the table. She knew Patricia Howell. They all knew Patricia Howell. The realization that Caroline had dragged a prominent family friend into a criminal conspiracy sent a shockwave of genuine fear through the attendees. Uncle Graham set the paper down, looking at my father with a mixture of pity and revulsion. The golden facade of the Rose family was cracking wide open. The pristine Ivy League veneer was shattering, revealing the desperate, rotting core hidden beneath decades of wealth and privilege. My parents had spent their entire lives cultivating an image of unimpeachable integrity, and I had just dismantled it with a single sheet of authenticated paper. But the execution was not over. The forged loan was only the mechanism of their desperation. The true poison, the reason they needed the money so urgently this specific week, was still waiting in the manila folder. My father thought the forgery was his darkest secret. He did not yet realize that the son he committed the crime for was harboring a secret that would burn the rest of their historic legacy to the ground. My father opened his mouth, drawing a shallow breath to construct another frantic excuse. He intended to weave a new fiction to explain away the forged signature as a desperate but noble act of parental sacrifice. Before a single syllable could escape his lips, Preston intervened. My brother pushed his chair back, the heavy wood scraping harshly against the Persian rug, and leaned over his empty plate. He looked at the horrified faces of our aunts, uncles, and cousins, trying to summon the polished charm that had shielded him since childhood. "It is just a temporary cash flow issue," Preston stammered. His voice wavered, lacking the deep, resonant confidence he usually projected in these social settings. "The bar exam is notoriously difficult this cycle. The pass rates are at a historic low across the entire eastern seaboard. I just need a little more time to study. Once I pass the retake, I have a guaranteed associate position waiting for me at a premier downtown firm. I will be on the partner track within 5 years. The compensation packages are enormous. I will pay off the entire loan balance before Penelope ever feels a ripple on her credit report." He looked at our father, seeking a familiar anchor, then turned his pleading eyes back to the rest of the room. "Mom and Dad were just trying to keep my focus on my studies," he insisted, his tone pleading for understanding. "They made a poor administrative choice to protect my preparation time. That is all this is, a logistical error, a bridge to get us to the finish line." I sat in my chair and watched my brother attempt to spin a felony identity theft into a minor logistical error. For 25 years, I had witnessed Preston talk his way out of every consequence. When he wrecked his first luxury sedan in high school, my father blamed the slick roads and immediately bought him a newer model. When he failed a critical undergraduate seminar, my mother arranged a private meeting with the university dean, resulting in a quiet administrative withdrawal instead of a failing grade on his transcript. Preston had lived his entire life wrapped in a protective layer of old money influence, convinced that the Rose family crest could shield him from the rules that governed the rest of society. He truly believed he could charm this dining room into overlooking wire fraud. But the Massachusetts State Bar Association did not care about our family crest. The regulatory committee did not attend my parents' weekend country club galas. They operated on hard evidence, and I had the final piece of evidence resting right inside my tote bag. I turned my gaze away from my parents and focused entirely on my brother. The frantic, sweating man standing across the mahogany table bore no resemblance to the golden boy I grew up with. The tailored charcoal suit looked too large for his shrinking frame. "You aren't studying for anything, Preston?" I said softly. The quiet certainty in my voice stopped his rambling defense instantly. He froze, his mouth hanging slightly open. A new kind of terror washed over his face, a raw, primal fear that told me he knew exactly what was coming next. He realized the boundary of my knowledge extended far beyond a bank document. I reached back into the plain manila folder. The certified bank copies were already sitting near Uncle Graham, but the file held one more crucial document. I pulled out the crisp single sheet of paper I had printed from the regulatory database earlier that week. The official seal of the State Office of Bar Counsel was stamped at the top, depicting a severe crest of blind justice holding a scale. I placed the paper on the white linen cloth and slid it across the long table. It traveled smoothly, coming to a stop directly in front of Aunt Vivian. "You didn't fail," I told him, ensuring every person in the Wellington room heard the distinction clearly. "You were permanently barred from practicing law in this state for academic fraud." Aunt Vivian looked down at the paper. She inhaled sharply, a loud, audible gasp that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the private dining room. She pressed her manicured hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock. For a senior partner at a corporate defense firm, a permanent disbarment notice was the equivalent of a death sentence. Uncle Graham snatched the document from the table before Vivian could push it away. He adjusted his reading glasses, his brow furrowing into a deep, angry crease. He did not read the text silently. Driven by an old judge's instinct to establish the indisputable facts of the record, he read the disciplinary notice aloud for the entire table to hear. "Respondent Preston Rose is hereby permanently disqualified from admission to the Massachusetts bar." Graham read, his gravelly voice trembling with righteous indignation. During the administration of the examination, the respondent was found in possession of an unauthorized digital transmitting device. Upon confrontation by the testing proctor, the respondent attempted to offer a cash bribe to secure the proctor's silence. Graham paused, his eyes scanning further down the page. He swallowed hard before continuing. Furthermore, a pending ethics grievance details a $50,000 extortion demand from a defrauded private tutor, linking the respondent to a broader pattern of deceptive academic practices. Graham stopped reading. He slowly lowered the paper to the table, staring at Preston as if my brother were a dangerous stranger who had just wandered off the street. The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Bribery, academic fraud, extortion, permanent disqualification. Preston did not try to deny it. He could not argue with the official ruling of the State Regulatory Board. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed backward into his dining chair, raising his trembling hands to bury his face. A low, muffled sob escaped his fingers, the pitiful sound of a hollow dynasty finally caving in on itself. I looked at my mother and father. The realization of what I had just exposed struck them with physical force. They had risked their freedom, compromised their closest friends, and destroyed my financial security to fund the rise of a legal scholar who did not exist. The entire justification for their crime evaporated in a single instant. They had forged a promissory note for $185,000 to cover the tracks of a disgraced, permanently disbarred son. The midnight phone call, the desperate demand for my savings, and the ambush dinner were all frantic attempts to pay off a blackmailer before the extended family realized the Golden Boy was a con artist. The elite family audience sat paralyzed, watching every agonizing second of the collapse. The uncles and cousins who had judged me mere minutes ago now stared at my parents with unbridled contempt. The pristine legacy they had worshipped for a century was dead-killed by their own relentless arrogance. The shift in the room was not gradual. It occurred with the sudden, breathtaking speed of a structural collapse. Richard Rose, the imposing patriarch who had dictated the terms of my entire existence, deflated before my eyes. The rigid posture that had intimidated courtrooms and boardrooms for 3 decades melted away. He looked around the long mahogany table, his eyes darting frantically from face to face, seeking a sympathetic gaze. He found none. Uncle Graham pushed his heavy dining chair back. The wood scraped harshly against the Persian rug, a sharp sound that cut through the lingering shock. He tossed his linen napkin onto his half-eaten steak. He did not look at my father with fraternal concern. He looked at him with the cold, calculating detachment of a retired appellate judge analyzing a fatal liability. Aunt Vivian followed suit, gathering her evening clutch and standing up. She was a senior partner at a firm that prided itself on ethical superiority. Her colleagues sat on the very regulatory committees that had just disqualified my brother. The realization that she had been summoned to this private dining room to unknowingly participate in a scheme to cover up a felony fraud sickened her. My father understood the silent arithmetic happening in their heads. These relatives were not just family members, they were the gatekeepers of the Boston legal establishment. They held the power to destroy his career, strip his club memberships, and ostracize him from the only society he valued. If word of this evening leaked outside the Wellington room, Richard would lose everything he had spent his life building. Panic seized him. The booming voice he had used to shame me into submission vanished, replaced by a frantic, reedy whisper. He hurried around the edge of the table, his tailored suit suddenly appearing loose on his shrinking frame. He stopped a few feet from my chair, holding his hands out with his palms facing upward in a gesture of pure, unadulterated surrender. "Penelope, please," he begged, glancing nervously at Graham and Vivian. "Lower your voice. We can keep this in the family. There is no need for this to escalate any further. We can fix this right now." He began to bargain, stripping away his own wealth piece by piece in a desperate attempt to buy my silence. He offered to list the Summer estate in Nantucket, the property they had purchased the year Preston was born. He promised to liquidate his equity shares at his law firm, drain his retirement portfolios, and cash out the life insurance policies he had maintained for 20 years. He swore he would march into the bank on Monday morning with a cashier's check to satisfy the entire balance of the defaulted loan. "I will make it disappear, Penelope," he pleaded, the sweat gathering on his brow. "I swear to you, you will not pay a single cent. Just destroy the folder." He pointed a trembling finger at the crisp white document resting near my water goblet. He needed me to pick up the silver fountain pen and sign the retroactive consent form. He needed my signature to transform his crime into a simple familial misunderstanding, wiping the slate clean so the criminal charges would vanish into the crisp Boston air. While my father attempted to negotiate his salvation, my mother was unraveling. The woman who had wept, practiced theatrical tears just moments ago, was now gasping for actual breath. Her chest heaved in rapid, shallow spasms. Her manicured hands clawed at the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles white. She stared at the certified notary stamp bearing Patricia Howell's name. Caroline understood the social ramifications of her actions better than anyone. She had implicated a prominent socialite in a federal crime. She pictured the flashing police lights pulling up to Patricia's historic brownstone. She envisioned the handcuffs, the arraignment, and the permanent expulsion from their elite social circles. The scandal would not just ruin their finances, it would obliterate their existence. Caroline turned to me, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "We will give you whatever you want," she cried, her voice cracking under the strain. "Just do not do this to Patricia. She did not know what she was stamping. She trusted me. Do not send my friend to prison. Please, Penelope." I sat in my chair and observed the two people pleading for my mercy. These were the same parents who had treated my childhood like an administrative error. They had spent my entire life funneling every ounce of their affection capital and praise into the son who was currently sobbing into his hands at the other end of the table. When I stood in the vestibule of St. Cecilia's on the most important day of my life, they had sent a brief, dismissive text message and left the front row empty. They had discarded me at every available opportunity. They viewed me only as a disposable credit score, a convenient, invisible asset they could steal to fund their delusions of grandeur. I waited for the rush of vindication. I expected to feel a surge of fiery triumph, the satisfying heat of vengeance finally achieved after years of neglect. Instead, I felt nothing but a profound, clarifying emptiness. The imposing giants of my youth were just desperate, frightened people grasping at straws. They had never loved Preston either. They only loved the prestige he represented. When he failed, they did not comfort him. They committed wire fraud to cover it up, using me as the human shield. The fear radiating from them was palpable, but it did not move me to pity. It merely confirmed that the emotional bridge between us had burned away long ago, leaving behind only the cold ashes of their deceit. The silver fountain pen still rested on the white linen cloth, gleaming under the warm light of the chandelier. My father watched my eyes fall upon it. He held his breath, waiting for me to accept his frantic bargain, waiting for me to save him just as he had demanded I do. I reached out. I placed my index finger against the smooth metal barrel of the expensive writing instrument. I did not pick it up. I applied a gentle, deliberate pressure and slid the pen across the table. It rolled smoothly over the fine fabric, coming to a halt directly in front of my father. I looked at the man who had tried to ruin my life, my expression devoid of anger, sorrow, or hesitation. "I am not a lawyer," I said smoothly. "I just record the truth for a living, and the record is set." I pushed my chair back from the mahogany table. The sound of the heavy wood scraping against the Persian rug broke the paralyzing spell that had fallen over the private dining room. The movement I made was fluid and unhurried. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my tailored slacks, and looked down at the centerpiece of the destruction. I did not gather the certified bank records or the printed disciplinary notice. I left the scattered pages right where they were resting on the pristine white linen cloth beneath the warm glow of the brass chandelier. They formed a permanent monument to the ruin of the Rose family legacy, an irrefutable paper trail of their own deceit. The relatives remained frozen in their seats, staring at the documents, as if the paper itself might catch fire. Uncle Graham kept his eyes fixed on the forged signature, the weight of the impending scandal visibly settling over his shoulders. Aunt Vivian refused to look in my direction, her attention anchored firmly to her empty plate, her mind racing to distance herself from the incoming fallout. Preston remained buried in his hands, unable to face the reality of his shattered future. My father stood paralyzed near the head of the table. The silver fountain pen rested exactly where I had pushed it. He had spent his entire life commanding courtrooms with his booming voice, and his impeccable pedigree assuming his authority was an unbreakable law of nature. Tonight, he was silenced by a single manila folder and a daughter who refused to play along. I turned my back on the patriarch. I picked up my leather tote bag from the floor, adjusted the strap over my shoulder, and began walking toward the heavy double doors of the Wellington room. My footsteps sounded deliberate, a steady rhythm marking my exit from their world. The oppressive, suffocating pressure that had defined every family gathering of my childhood vanished from my shoulders. I felt profoundly light. I was unburdened by their expectations. I did not owe them my savings. I did not owe them my credit profile. I did not owe them my silence to protect their fragile social standing. As I reached out to grasp the brass handle of the door, a sound fractured the quiet of the dining room. Penelope. It was my mother. The word was a raw, desperate gasp, stripped of all the sugary pretense and manufactured grace she had worn like armor for decades. It was the sound of a woman watching her social survival evaporate into thin air. She was begging me to turn around to offer a sliver of hope to negotiate a secret truce that would save her country club memberships and keep her out of a federal courtroom. For a fraction of a second, the instinct ingrained in every child tugged at my conscience. The old, familiar urge to comfort my mother, to fix her mistakes and earn her approval flickered in my chest. I extinguished that instinct instantly. I understood that she was not crying for the loss of her daughter. She was crying for the loss of her reputation. I did not turn around. I did not offer a comforting glance or a final word of condemnation. I gripped the brass handle, pushed the heavy doors open, and stepped over the threshold into the corridor. I pulled the door firmly shut behind me. The heavy wood clicked into place with a satisfying finality, cutting off the frantic whispers and the desperate pleading, trapping them inside the cage of their own making. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway of the country club. The air in the corridor felt distinctly different from the heavy atmosphere of the private dining room. It was cool still and remarkably serene. I passed the towering oil portraits of past club presidents' men with stern expressions and tailored suits who looked exactly like my father and Uncle Graham. During my childhood, those portraits had felt imposing, a constant reminder of the historic Bostonian old money heritage I was failing to uphold. Tonight, they just looked like fading paint on stretched canvas. The ghosts of the Ivy League dynasty held no power over me anymore. I walked past the mahogany sideboards and the ornate floral arrangements, my head held high, my posture perfect. I had spent 25 years shrinking myself to fit into the margins of their grand narrative, hiding in the shadows while they celebrated my brother. I was finally claiming my own space. I emerged into the grand foyer. The uniformed maitre d' offered a polite nod as I passed, entirely unaware of the explosive devastation I had just left in his most exclusive dining room. I pushed through the glass front entrance and stepped out onto the wide stone portico. The crisp autumn air hit my face sharp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the cold night air. The physical relief was intoxicating. I had braced myself for a chaotic, drawn-out shouting match. I had prepared to defend myself against their relentless intimidation tactics. I realized then that true power is not about screaming the loudest or having the last word. True power is placing the indisputable truth on the table and having the courage to simply walk away. I bypassed the bustling valet stand and walked down the gravel driveway. The crunch of the small stones under my shoes felt grounding, tethering me to the present moment. Parked near the edge of the lot, far away from the imported luxury sedans and the chauffeur-driven town cars, sat a familiar 10-year-old sedan. The engine was idling, producing a steady, comforting hum in the quiet night. The headlights cut a bright yellow path through the darkness. Jack had not waited at our suburban home as I had suggested. He had driven to the country club and waited in the parking lot, positioning himself as a silent sentry, ready to intervene if the ambush turned vicious. He knew the depths of my parents' cruelty, and he refused to leave me entirely isolated on their territory. I opened the passenger door and slid into the warm interior. The scent of the car was a profound comfort. It smelled of old leather peppermint gum and Jack's familiar cedar cologne. It smelled like my real life, the authentic life I had chosen and built from the ground up. Jack shifted the car into park and turned to face me. The dashboard lights cast a soft orange glow over his features. He searched my face, scanning my eyes for signs of distress, looking for lingering trauma from the confrontation. He saw the relaxed line of my shoulders. He saw the steady, calm rhythm of my breathing. "Is it done?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. I looked at the man who had stood by me in the church vestibule when the front row was empty, the man who had supported me without demanding I conform to an arbitrary standard of greatness. I did not need to recount the details of the dinner. I did not need to explain the horror on my mother's face or the collapse of my brother's facade. I nodded once. "Yes," I told him, "it is done." Jack did not press for the details of the confrontation. He reached over, squeezed my hand, and shifted the car back into gear. He turned the steering wheel and guided us out of the sprawling country club estate. We drove through the wrought iron gates, leaving the manicured lawns and the suffocating pressure of the Boston dynasty far behind us in the rearview mirror. The drive home was incredibly peaceful. The rhythmic thrum of the tires on the highway felt like a steady heartbeat. I watched the bright city lights blur past the passenger window, replaced gradually by the quiet, dark stretches of the suburban roads. My emotional arc was complete. I felt no lingering desire to seek my parents' approval. I no longer mourned their absence from my wedding day. I understood that their rejection had never been a reflection of my worth. It had been a testament to their profound shallowness. They were incapable of loving a daughter who refused to act as an accessory to their ambition. By laying the evidence on the table and walking out the door, I had severed the toxic roots that tied me to the Rose family tree. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, watching the familiar street lamps of our neighborhood approach. The quiet satisfaction settling in my chest was absolute. I had protected my marriage, my savings, and my future. I was finally free to cultivate my own life, rooted in honesty, respect, and mutual support. But my role in the conflict was not yet finished. The documents resting on the dining room table were only the opening statement. The morning would bring the harsh light of reality, and my parents would discover that the truth I recorded was not meant to stay within the family. I had promised to hold them accountable, and the legal machinery required to enforce that promise was already waiting for Monday morning. The weekend passed in a quiet, restorative blur. When Monday morning arrived, the sky over Massachusetts was a crisp, clear blue. I did not wait for a formal apology or a frantic settlement offer from my father. I knew how the Boston legal elite operated. They relied on backroom deals and hushed compromises. They survived by keeping their indiscretions out of the public record, using their wealth to bury their mistakes before a judge ever saw them. I was a certified court reporter. My entire existence was devoted to maintaining the public record. After drinking a single cup of coffee, I picked up the leather tote bag containing the manila folder, kissed Jack goodbye, and drove straight to the local police precinct. The station was a stark contrast to the velvet confines of the Wellington Room. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the scuffed linoleum floor. The air smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor wax. I sat across a dented metal desk from a seasoned financial crimes detective. I did not shed a single tear. I did not embellish the story with emotional grievances about my ruined wedding or my childhood neglect. I presented the certified master promissory note, the timeline of my rehearsal dinner, and the state disciplinary notice outlining my brother's bribery attempt. I laid the paper trail bare, explaining the precise mechanics of the forgery with clinical detachment. The detective took my statement, his expression shifting from routine boredom to sharp, focused attention as the scale of the wire fraud became apparent. He recognized the names involved. He understood the implications of a prominent socialite applying a fraudulent notary seal to a six-figure banking document. By filing a formal sworn police report, I triggered a mechanism my parents could not bribe or charm their way out of. The legal gears began to grind, and they moved with a ruthless mechanical efficiency. 3 weeks later, the logical consequences of my family's arrogance unfolded with devastating speed. The lending institution received a copy of the police report and immediately froze the defaulted account. Banks despise liability, and discovering a forged signature on a lucrative private loan catalyzed a swift, unforgiving corporate response. A specialized fraud division launched a rigorous investigation into the origination file. They did not care about the historic Rose legacy. They cared about their bottom line and their regulatory compliance. The investigators started with the weakest link in the chain. They knocked on the polished wooden door of Patricia Howell. The prominent socialite and loyal bridge partner wilted under the pressure of a formal law enforcement interrogation. Faced with the undeniable proof of her illicit notary stamp and the threat of severe federal penalties, Patricia confessed. She admitted to authenticating a binding financial document without my physical presence, claiming my mother had assured her it was a mere administrative oversight meant to help Preston. The state regulatory board did not care about her excuses. Patricia was stripped of her notary commission within days and formally indicted for her role in the conspiracy. The ensuing scandal ripped through the elite social circles of Boston like a shockwave. The same women who had attended my mother's charity galas and weekend brunches turned their backs on her. Caroline was quietly asked to resign from her prestigious country club committees. Her phone stopped ringing. The tight-knit society she had worshipped her entire life shunned her, treating her like a dangerous contagion. She became a pariah in her own kingdom, trapped in a silent, empty house, terrified to show her face at the local boutiques or the afternoon luncheons. The fallout for my father was far more severe. The bank and the local prosecutor presented Richard with a stark, uncompromising ultimatum. He could face formal indictment for felony wire fraud and identity theft, which carried a mandatory federal prison sentence upon conviction, or he could make immediate, full restitution of the stolen funds. For a man who had spent 3 decades commanding respect in prestigious courtrooms, the prospect of standing before a judge in handcuffs was an unbearable humiliation. He chose the only path that kept him out of a jail cell. Satisfying a balance of $185,000 overnight required immense, painful sacrifices. Richard was forced to liquidate his coveted equity shares at his downtown law firm. He drained the retirement accounts he had spent a lifetime building, wiping out his financial security in a matter of days. When the liquid assets fell short, he had to take out a heavy, high-interest mortgage on the historic family estate. The ancestral home that had served as the crown jewel of the Rose dynasty was suddenly leveraged to the hilt. His colleagues at the law firm learned of the quiet liquidation. The whispered rumors of his ethical breaches spread rapidly through the partnerships. He was not formally disbarred, but his reputation was irreparably fractured. He became a distinct liability to the firm's pristine image. He was stripped of his power, demoted from his leadership roles, and relegated to reviewing minor contracts in a corner office. The patriarch, who had once demanded my obedience, was now a disgraced, hollow figure, working simply to pay off the interest on a house he could no longer afford. With my father financially decimated, the endless stream of capital that had funded my brother's luxurious lifestyle abruptly dried up. Preston was evicted from his high-rise apartment in the city. The imported sports car he drove was repossessed by the dealership. The golden boy found himself standing on the street with empty pockets and a ruined name. The permanent censure from the State Bar Association acted as a lethal brand. No law firm, no corporate compliance office, and no legal advocacy group would hire a candidate publicly condemned for bribery and academic fraud. His expensive Ivy League degrees were rendered worthless by a single sheet of disciplinary paper. Stripped of his inheritance and locked out of his chosen profession, Preston had to confront the harsh reality of earning a living without a safety net. For the first time in his 27 years, he had to apply for entry-level employment. He secured a minimum wage position at a suburban retail electronics store. The heir to the Rose legal empire now spent his days wearing a polyester polo shirt, stocking inventory shelves, and trying to sell extended warranties to passing customers. He lived in a cramped, dark studio apartment located miles away from the affluent neighborhoods he used to frequent. The crushing weight of ordinary life settled over him, forcing him to experience the very struggles he had once mocked me for enduring. The gossip burned through the Ivy League network, a wildfire of speculation and eager schadenfreude. The Boston elite whispered about the spectacular collapse of the Rose family at every cocktail party and networking event. They traded rumors about the forged signature, the disbarred son, and the disgraced patriarch. But the gossip never touched me. I remained insulated from the wreckage, protected by the impenetrable wall of documented facts I had calmly laid on the table in the Wellington room. I did not participate in the rumor mill. I did not grant interviews or answer the curious phone calls from distant relatives seeking morbid details. I let the official public records speak for themselves. My life continued with a peaceful, steady rhythm. I returned to the courthouse every morning, setting up my steno machine in front of the judge's bench. The lawyers who argued their cases in my presence treated me with the same polite indifference they always had, wholly unaware that the quiet woman recording their words had recently dismantled one of the most powerful legal families in their jurisdiction. The irony was a quiet comfort. My parents had always believed my profession was a mark of failure. They failed to realize that the discipline required to capture the exact truth was the very tool that secured my freedom. I found a profound sense of closure in the logical consequences of their actions. There was no need for dramatic screaming matches or vindictive retaliation. The justice system they had revered and manipulated for generations operated exactly as it was designed to. When presented with irrefutable evidence of a crime, the law simply applied the appropriate penalty. The destruction of their dynasty was not a petty act of vengeance on my part. It was a self-inflicted wound. They had built a towering structure on a foundation of lies, and I had simply removed the single pillar holding it up. Winter arrived in Massachusetts with a quiet, insulating snowfall. The heavy white blanket covered the suburban streets, silencing the usual noise of the neighborhood and casting a serene, icy glow through the windows of my home. Several months had passed since the explosive confrontation in the private dining room of the country club. The legal machinery I set into motion had run its course, systematically dismantling the pristine facade of my family. I spent the intervening weeks focusing on my marriage, my career at the courthouse, and the simple grounding routines of a life free from constant scrutiny. My home became a true sanctuary. The air inside felt light, devoid of the suffocating pressure that had defined every moment of my childhood. On a Tuesday evening in late January, I walked down the driveway to collect the mail. The frigid wind bit at my cheeks as I opened the metal box. I gathered a stack of utility bills, a few glossy catalogs, and a handful of local advertisements. Nestled in the center of the mundane correspondence was a thick, cream-colored envelope. I did not need to check the return address to identify the sender. The handwriting leaped off the paper, striking a deep, familiar chord in my memory. The letters were elegant, sweeping, and ornate. The capital P in my name featured a distinct looping flourish at the top, crafted with a heavy, deliberate hand. It was the exact same script that had forged my signature on the master promissory note. A sudden chill traveled down my spine, having nothing to do with the winter air. My mother had found my address. I carried the stack of mail inside, locking the front door behind me. The house smelled of roasting garlic and melted butter. Jack stood at the kitchen island wearing a faded sweater, humming a low tune while he chopped vegetables for dinner. The warm yellow light of the kitchen cast long shadows across the hardwood floor. He looked up, offered a bright smile, and asked about my day at the courthouse. I returned his smile, placed the bills on the counter, and held on to the cream-colored envelope. I sat down on a wooden stool, staring at my name rendered in the deceptive, beautiful ink. I slid my finger under the glued flap and tore the heavy paper open. The letter was long, spanning 4 dense pages of expensive stationery. The scent of my mother's signature floral perfume clung to the fibers, a ghostly intrusion into my safe haven. I unfolded the pages and began to read. I evaluated her words not as a daughter seeking maternal affection, but as a stenographer analyzing a transcript for hidden motives. Caroline began her correspondence with a sweeping preamble about the passage of time and the healing nature of family bonds. She did not open with an apology. She opened with an excuse. She painted a tragic, elaborate picture of the historic Boston legal culture, describing it as a crushing, unforgiving environment that demanded perfection from its inhabitants. She claimed that she and my father were simply victims of their own environment, blinded by the immense pressure to secure Preston's future within an elite society that tolerated no failures. She wrote about the intoxicating nature of ambition, suggesting that their desperate need to guide my brother through a rigid system had clouded their judgment. She detailed the current suffering of the Rose family, hoping to elicit my sympathy. She wrote about the deafening silence in their grand estate, the sting of being ostracized by their closest friends, and the profound humiliation of my father's demotion at his law firm. She described Preston's current state with dramatic sorrow, lamenting his minimum wage job and his tiny apartment as if they were cruel, unjust punishments inflicted by a random universe. She framed the felony fraud not as a deliberate attack on my financial security, but as a misguided act of profound parental love that had tragically backfired. Then halfway through the 3rd page, the tone of the letter shifted. The sorrowful recounting of their downfall vanished, replaced by a sugary maternal cadence I recognized instantly. It was the exact same tone she had utilized in the Wellington room right before she slid the retroactive consent form across the mahogany table. She wrote about how much they missed my quiet strength. She claimed that blood tied us together, regardless of past hardships, insisting that a family must stand united to weather the darkest storms. She showered me with manufactured praise, calling me the true anchor of the Rose dynasty. The flattery was merely the setup for the true purpose of the letter. Caroline finally revealed her hand on the final page. She begged me to contact the local prosecutor overseeing the financial crimes investigation. She asked me to submit a formal sworn statement of reconciliation, requesting that I frame the forged signature as an authorized, informal family arrangement that was simply executed poorly due to a lack of communication. She pleaded with me to formally withdraw the police reports. She promised that if the criminal charges were dropped and the public scandal mitigated, the family could finally reunite, heal, and move forward together in perfect harmony. I lowered the pages to the granite countertop. I sat very still, listening to the rhythmic, comforting sound of Jack's knife hitting the cutting board. The absence of genuine remorse was glaring. My mother never once said she was sorry for stealing my identity. She never acknowledged the trauma of abandoning me on my wedding day to orchestrate a felony. She did not regret the harm she inflicted upon my life. She only regretted that she had been caught. She was sorry her empire had crumbled, and she was sorry she could no longer show her face at the country club. The realization washed over me cold and clear. The remorse on the paper was entirely counterfeit. My parents still viewed me through the exact same lens they always had. I was not a person to them. I was a tool. I was a convenient mechanism to be deployed for their salvation. They had summoned me to a dinner to use me as a financial shield, and now they were sending a letter to use me as a legal shield. A year ago, reading a plea like this might have triggered a deep, conditioned response. The younger version of myself might have felt a hollow pang of guilt reading about their ruined lives. I might have picked up the phone, driven by a lifelong, desperate yearning to fix my broken family and finally earn a sliver of their elusive affection. I might have negotiated my own boundaries to purchase a temporary, fragile peace. That version of Penelope no longer existed. The crucible of the country club had burned away every lingering illusion I held about my parents. I picked up the 4 pages of expensive stationery. I did not shed a tear. I did not feel the urge to draft an angry response or place a furious phone call to demand accountability. I aligned the edges of the thick paper perfectly. I folded the letter in half, pressing my thumb firmly along the crease. I folded it again, transforming the long, rambling manipulation into a small, insignificant square. Jack turned away from the stove, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel. He noticed the folded paper on the counter and the solemn expression on my face. He stepped closer, his eyes filled with quiet concern. "Do you need to make a phone call?" he asked gently. I looked at my husband, feeling a profound surge of gratitude for the life we had built together. I shook my head. "I do not need to call anyone," I told him. I slid off the wooden stool and walked across the kitchen toward the small home office in the adjacent room. I approached the paper shredder sitting beside the desk. I flipped the power switch. The machine hummed to life with a low mechanical growl. I held the folded square of paper over the narrow slot and let it drop. The steel blades caught the thick stationery, instantly pulling it downward with a harsh grinding sound, shredding the desperate lies into tiny, illegible ribbons. The conflict was permanently closed. The silence that followed the shredder turning off felt vast and pure. I had finally learned the hardest, most vital lesson of my life. Some people do not want a daughter to cherish and love. They only want a resource to extract. By destroying the letter, I reclaimed my final piece of autonomy, leaving the ghosts of Boston to haunt their own empty halls. The winter snow melted into a vibrant, humid Massachusetts spring, and a full year slipped past the evening I walked out of the Wellington room. Time has a distinct way of clarifying the landscape after a storm. When I look back at the pattern of my survival over the past 12 months, I realize that my escape was not orchestrated in a single sudden motion. It was built through a series of quiet, deliberate choices. I chose to ignore the notification on my wedding night to protect my peace. I chose to walk into the bank and demand the original file. I chose to sit at the mahogany table and let the patriarch of the Rose family exhaust his own authority before I laid the truth bare. Survival is rarely loud, it is usually methodical. My parents relied on volume intimidation and the suffocating weight of their historic Boston lineage to bend reality to their will. They believed that raising their voices would drown out the facts. I learned that silence is far more lethal when paired with undeniable evidence. I often think about the 2 empty seats in the front row of St. Cecilia's Chapel. On the day of my wedding, those vacant spaces felt like a glaring physical wound. They represented a lifetime of rejection, a final public declaration that I was merely a secondary asset, not worth the investment of their time. Today, I view those empty seats as a profound gift. They cleared the room for the people who actually mattered. Family is not defined by shared genetics or a gold-embossed crest on a country club membership application. It is not defined by a sprawling estate in Nantucket or a century of old money heritage. Family is defined by the people who show up on your wedding day without needing to be coaxed, bribed, or threatened. Jack stood beside me in the vestibule and offered his arm when the shadows threatened to consume me. His brother offered a terrible toast that filled the reception hall with genuine laughter. My friends danced until the floorboards shook. The people who stayed in my life did not calculate my worth based on my earning potential or my Ivy League prospects. They stayed because they valued my presence. They taught me that love is not a transaction you must earn. It is a secure foundation you build together. That foundation became a tangible reality on a Tuesday morning in late May. Jack and I walked into a small, sunlit real estate office to close on our first house. The irony of the setting was not lost on me. Less than a year ago, I sat in a sterile bank office staring at a fraudulent loan designed to destroy my future. Now I sat across from a smiling escrow agent holding a pen of my own free will. The fraud investigation had concluded in my favor months prior. The bank expunged the defaulted loan from my record, acknowledging the felony forgery and clearing the catastrophic balance. My credit profile was legally restored to its pristine state, reflecting years of my own quiet diligence rather than my brother's reckless entitlement. The escrow agent slid a thick stack of mortgage documents across the table. I picked up a simple blue ballpoint pen. I read every single clause, verifying the interest rates, the terms, and the fine print with the trained eye of a stenographer. When I reached the final page, I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name. The script was efficient, sharp, and hurried. It was unmistakably mine. We were handed the keys to a modest, beautiful home with a wraparound porch and a yard that required our own labor. It was not a sprawling historic estate, but it was ours, purchased with honest money and an unblemished name. My professional life mirrored the stability of my new home. I returned to the courthouse every day, setting up my machine in the familiar hush of the wood-paneled courtrooms. The Boston legal elite continued to parade through the double doors, arguing their cases and posturing for the gallery. I remained the invisible observer, typing every word into the official record. But the dynamic shifted. The judges who presided over these high-stakes trials recognized my precision. They requested my assignment for complex, multi-week civil litigations. They knew my work ethic, valuing the flawless accuracy of my transcripts over the prestigious last names of the attorneys pacing the floor. The career my father openly mocked as a failure of ambition became the cornerstone of my empowerment. Taking dictation taught me how to decipher the architecture of a lie, but it also taught me the enduring power of the truth. The court record does not care about your social standing or your tailored suit. It only cares about what can be proven. I found an immense sustaining peace in that simplicity. I did not need to make history the way Preston was groomed to do. I was perfectly content recording it, ensuring that the facts remained untampered and secure. People often ask me if I harbor any regrets regarding the state of my family. They hear the rumors about my father's demotion and my brother's minimum wage job in the retail electronics store, and they assume I must carry some latent guilt for initiating their downfall. Society conditions us to believe that exposing family secrets is a betrayal regardless of the crimes committed. We are taught to absorb the damage to keep the peace and to protect the legacy at the expense of our own sanity. I reject that conditioning. I do not feel a single ounce of guilt. Guilt implies a failure of moral duty, and my only duty was to protect the family I chose from the predators I was born to. The Rose dynasty collapsed because it was structurally unsound, built on a foundation of arrogance and sustained by constant manipulation. I did not light the fire, I simply refused to be the human shield they used to smother the flames. When you spend your entire childhood designated as the scapegoat, you internalize a profound sense of inadequacy. You believe you must earn your right to exist by fixing the mistakes of the golden child. Breaking that cycle requires a radical acceptance of reality. You must accept that the people who use you as a resource are incapable of offering you genuine love. They only offer conditional tolerance, and the price of that tolerance is your freedom. The day I walked out of the Wellington room, I stopped paying the toll. I left the debt, the drama, and the deceit on the white linen tablecloth and walked into the crisp night air with nothing but the truth. The lightness I feel now, sitting on the porch of the house Jack and I bought, is the direct result of severing those toxic roots. I look directly into the camera lens, resting my hands on the solid oak of my own kitchen table, and speak with quiet power. If you have a folder of your own proof that you were the scapegoat for someone else's golden child, stop waiting for an apology you'll never get. Don't shout, just set the truth on the table and walk away. Drop the word freedom in the comments if you've ever had to sever a toxic root to save yourself. The lens captures a deep, cleansing breath. The video fades out on my calm, victorious smile, the final image of a woman who stopped reading from their script and finally wrote her own. When the heavy oak doors are closed and the outside world is locked away, what truly sustains the foundation of a family? The story of the Rose family, a tale woven through the high-pressure elite corridors of American legal dynasties, feels extreme on the surface, yet as a spiritual practitioner observing the currents of our modern achievement-driven culture, I see their story not just as a dramatic saga of financial fraud, but as a profound parable. It is a mirror held up to a spiritual sickness that creeps into our homes when we become too busy looking at our neighborhood standards to look at our children's souls. In traditional American culture, we pride ourselves on building a better future for our offspring. We value hard work, legacy, and success. But in high-pressure environments, there is a dangerous creeping temptation to view our children as extensions of our own egos. We risk transforming them into trophies meant to secure our own social status. When the Rose parents groomed Preston, their golden child, they stopped nurturing a human soul and began building an idol. Every child arrives in our arms with their own unique spiritual blueprint, a distinct nature that must be discovered with patience, not dictated with a heavy hand. When we force a child into a rigid, predetermined mold of success, worshiping their grades, their degrees, and their accolades, while ignoring their character, we sever their connection to their authentic self. The consequence of this parental blindness is a tragically hollow foundation. Preston was shielded from the consequences of his actions and inflated by false transactional praise. Because of this, he developed zero spiritual resilience. When the illusion of his brilliance inevitably cracked under the weight of reality, he possessed no inner willpower to sustain himself, leading him straight into academic fraud, bribery, and ultimate collapse. He was given everything, yet equipped for nothing. This brings us to the most devastating aspect of the Rose family's failure, the karmic cost of transactional love. Parenting is a sacred responsibility grounded in honesty and fairness. But in this narrative, the parents treated their love like a corporate ledger. They invested only in the child they believed would yield a high social return, measuring human worth by Ivy League titles and public reputation. In doing so, they entirely abandoned their moral center. The universe, however, operates on an inescapable law of balance. You simply cannot build a lasting family legacy on a foundation of deceit, favoritism, and cruelty. The parents believed they could outsmart the truth by manipulating the paperwork of their lives, by forging Penelope's name and stealing her future to protect Preston's facade. But spiritual debt always comes due. By sacrificing their daughter to save their son's illusion, they triggered their own total destruction. True morality and true family responsibility is not defined by how you are perceived in a country club, a courtroom, or a suburban cul-de-sac. It is defined entirely by how you treat the most vulnerable people in your care when no one else is watching. And then there is Penelope, the invisible daughter. Her journey stands as the ultimate testament to spiritual willpower and emotional awareness. She was ignored and discarded, yet she did not allow her parents' blindness to define her vision of herself. True strength does not come from inherited privilege or a polished last name. It is forged in the fires of adversity, honesty, and radical acceptance. Penelope gained her wisdom the hard way. By learning to read the silence between her family's lies, she accepted the heartbreaking reality that her family's toxic roots could never nourish her. She demonstrated to all of us that the highest form of willpower is the courage to walk away from a toxic cycle without malice, without screaming, and without a desire for vengeance. She simply presented the undeniable truth on that mahogany table and let the natural consequences unfold. In doing so, she broke a generational curse and freed herself to build a life of genuine peace. She built her own traditional family structure with her husband Jack, founded not on what they could leverage, but on who they authentically were. How do we ensure our own families do not fall into this trap? As American parents navigating an increasingly competitive world, we must actively cultivate emotional awareness within our households. We have to look at our children, truly look at them, and ask ourselves a terrifying but necessary question. Are you raising a resume, or are you raising a human being? To guide our children toward a better life, we must cultivate homes where love is a secure foundation, not a conditional reward doled out for good behavior or high test scores. Imparting wisdom means helping a child discover their true path, even if it isn't the path we originally envisioned for them. Imparting morality means demonstrating integrity over appearances, showing them through our daily actions that telling the truth is infinitely more important than looking good to the outside world. Imparting willpower means allowing our children to face their own failures, letting them fall so they can learn the vital life-sustaining skill of standing back up on their own 2 feet. The stories we tell ourselves about our families are the stories that shape our children's futures, echoing through generations. If this reflection has moved you, if you see shadows of your own journey or the journey of someone you love in these words, I encourage you to join our community. Subscribe and follow the channel QT Told Stories. We explore the deep, quiet, and loud truths of family life, offering narratives that heal, challenge, and inspire. By sharing these stories, we can all learn to break the cycles that hold us back and build family foundations that are rooted in fairness, honesty, and enduring love. As the dust settles on the Rose family's legacy, we are left to look around our own living rooms. We fold the laundry, we help with the homework, and we turn off the lights at the end of the day. But in the quiet dark, a question lingers. When the world eventually strips away our professional titles, our bank accounts, and our carefully curated social standing, what remains of the love we gave our children? Will they remember the warmth of our unconditional presence? Or will they only remember the heavy, suffocating weight of our expectations? We spend our whole lives trying to build a house our children can be proud of. We can only hope that in the end it is a place they actually want to come home to.